I've played a lot of Genesis games and I can comfortably say the Genesis had a chip on its shoulder. Many of the games that were released, they were stupid hard. They took on the challenge of being edgier than Nintendo, and in some ways they knocked it out of the park. That's the purpose of today's episode, to talk about my top 10 hardest Genesis games. Now, difficulty, it's a very subjective thing. What's easy for me might not be easy for you, and vice versa. That's the duality of our skills, and each of our skills are different. So try to keep an open mind. Let's begin. Target Earth is a rather interesting game, and it's made by a rather interesting company. And by interesting, I mean Messiah, which between me and you, I've had nothing but bad experiences with their games, at least on the PC Engine. I guess it's because the ones I've played, they've been kind of throwaways, like Motor Rotor. That being said, they did find a sweet spot with games that involved shooting, and Target Earth is one of those games. It's a run and gun that takes place in 2201, where mankind can live anywhere in the universe, and as such, we need a good clean war. That war is between Earth and a cyborg army, the Kron. When you boot it up, you'll see exactly why it's on this list. There's an astronomical amount of nonsense being shot your way, and I'm all for it. I love games where you have a shit ton of projectiles coming your way, and this game was exceptionally challenging, but well balanced. It's part of the Assault Suit Lanos series that's been around for a while now, with their most recent game being named the same thing on the PS4. There are games that challenge you, and then there are games that are mean. Fatal Labyrinth is best described as a slow descent into madness from a passive-aggressive programmer. It's a slow game, and that speed isn't helped by the fact that there are tons of pitfalls, traps, and enemies that want to make you have a really bad day. If there was a game that existed for the sole point of making you learn from your mistakes, it would be this one. Some people call this a roguelike, but I've never bothered to check out any roguelikes, so I can't vouch for it. But I can say this one it's up there. On the NES, we had Solstice, on the Super Nintendo we had Equinox, and on the Genesis we had The Immortal, which isn't related to the previous two games, but it plays much like the others. Now you might recognize this game because it was on the NES as well. In fact, it was on a few computers as well, and the two home console ports were for the NES and the Genesis, and they practically play the same. That being said, the graphics are obviously better, but the big difference to me was the combat itself. In the NES version, it's more action-oriented, and the enemies can be more predictable. That goes out of the window with the Genesis version, which requires your decisions to be more deliberate and strategic, right? That being said, I do find the NES version to be way more difficult, solely because it's so random in the level design, whereas the Genesis version seems to be more open and interconnected. There's more of a focus on solving puzzles. That being said, it's not going to be easy. This is a damn hard game. You might think, what's this game about? Did Cad Bane get his own video game? Is this some weird Tales of the Crypt spinoff? No, it's Shakan the Forever Man, a guy from a comic book created by Robert Krause. I don't even know how to explain this. He's a guy who is so full of self-confidence that he believes that death can't beat him in a fight, so he wakes up and says, you know what, screw it, I'm gonna go fight death. And Death was like, okay, but if I win, you're gonna be my bitch for like forever, man. And he was like, well, isn't that convenient? Because I want to live forever, man. And there's your plot. Shakan wins and becomes the Forever Man, but he has to walk the earth until he kills all the evils on the planet. And let me tell you something, it's not an easy walk. It's like stepping on Legos at 3 in the morning, and you can't shout because your baby's asleep. It's a fiend. This game as a platformer has some of the most brutal level design I have ever seen. The bosses are assholes, and if that's not enough, let's sprinkle on a timer. Every child of the 90s loves good old-fashioned time pressure, right? I love Streets of Rage 1 and 2. I actually prefer 2 myself, but then we have the third entry in the equation, which many people consider the black sheep in the original trilogy. If you know Streets of Rage, or Bare Knuckle as it's called in Japan, then you know it's a beat 'em up, a damn good one as well, with fantastic music from Yuzo Koshiro. We beat the shit out of everyone, and that's that. With Streets of Rage 3, we have all of that, but we also have enemies that have increased speed, and I personally believe that normal is Japanese hard, which wouldn't be the first time Japan's made that distinction. They did it for Devil May Cry 3, and there's probably tons of games where that occurred. I think one of the more frustrating parts about Streets of Rage 3 is the plot. Yet again, Mr. X is up to no good and unleashes robots created by Dr. Damn, and our usual suspects have to go kick his ass. Again, for the third time. You can actually play as quite a few characters, be it Shiva, if you hold down B after kicking his ass, or a kangaroo, if you defeat Bruce and then let him go free. It's a very silly game, and you'll often hear me regard it as a Yuzo Koshiro album that happens to have a video game tied to it. Ever heard of Telnet Japan? They made a really important game, well, for some of you, especially those who enjoy RPGs. Megami Tensei, well, at least the first one. What about Valis? Ever heard of that? I want to say Valis was their cash cow for a long time, but one game that is notorious on the Genesis for being a slap to the back of the neck is Gyarados, which is a horizontal shooter. We play as Dan Dare, who pilots a Gulfer spaceship with the intention of stopping the United Cluster of Lizaluth. Yeah, great place to live, Lizaluth. Honestly, this game reminds me of an angry R-Type. One of the things that stood out to me was that the enemies do not have a predetermined path, like other games at the time would have. Enemies 100% are based on where you are, which makes dodging incredibly difficult. We also have this thing called a Taz pod, and it acts like the pod from R-Type, except instead of bonus power-ups, we basically allow the pod to strike an enemy, and it steals its power. It's a great game, and oftentimes it's considered one of the most difficult horizontal shooters on the Genesis. I can't stand Shinobi. Shinobi in the arcades is one of those games that lets you put constant credits in and continue until you get to the last stage, but if you die in the last stage, fuck you. You lose. Doesn't matter if you put coins in the machine, you're not getting them back. Get good or get out. Same thing with Darius. Darius broke my heart. Now, The Revenge of Shinobi is a continuation of Shinobi. It was the first one on the Genesis, but in the arcades there are two Shinobi games, obviously the original Shinobi and Shadow Dancer, both of which kicked my ass. Now we're on the Genesis, taking that same insufferable ass kicking in the comfort of my home. Wake up, get my ass kicked by society, come home, get my ass kicked by my dad for having bad grades, go to my neighbors, get my ass kicked by Shinobi, go to bed, get my ass kicked by the stark realization of conscious existence. The perpetual loop. This game was the catalyst to a lot of the anger that I have in my life. To me, it all boils down to precision, precision, precision. You make one wrong move, the enemies will take advantage of it, and that's Sega in a nutshell. Those enemies do tons of damage. Also, your shurikens, limited asset. So don't feel sad if you use the shuriken cheat. I won't judge you. The world might, but I won't. The most recent Shinobi game for anybody who cares was Shinobi on the 3DS, but there's supposedly another game coming out soon. Fingers crossed. This is a legacy franchise from Sega, and while I don't particularly like it, I do like seeing legacy franchises stay afloat. If SNK is notorious for kicking you in the dick, Toa Plan is the person holding you down while you're being kicked in the dick. And if we want to go further, Team Shanghai Alice, the creators of Touhou, they're standing behind him giving him a thumbs up. Toa Plan made some badass shooters, but they don't come without their difficulty. The big reason why I find Hellfire so difficult is because for whatever reason they zoomed in a lot, like a lot, to the point where you don't have much wiggle room at all, either to move or to shoot the enemies that you're encountering. You really have to pay attention for 30 minutes if you want to beat this. That's assuming you can go all the way through. Now don't forget, this game was an arcade game, so I was kind of impressed by this port. Capcom historically dragged its nuts across our foreheads with the Ghosts and Goblins franchise. They did it on the NES, they did it on the Super Nintendo with Super Ghouls and Ghosts, they did it on the PlayStation 2 with Maximo, but Ghouls and Ghosts on the Genesis, it's a hard fucking game, and I loved it. I'm a baby when it comes to encountering forced difficulty, and while I beat Ghosts and Goblins, I hated it. However, I really enjoyed Ghouls and Ghosts. And I don't know if it's because you get unlimited continues or if I fell victim to some weird Stockholm syndrome, but I actually really enjoyed it. Going back to the original NES game's plot, I'm fairly certain Arthur was boning a chick in the graveyard, right? No other reason for him to be in his boxers. And we beat Lucifer. Ghouls and Ghosts, we find out that Lucifer is very upset, so he comes back in full force to unleash a hell unlike any other on the general public. And once again, Arthur has to go slap some sense into him. Or should I say Loki, because in the American release, he's known as Loki, probably because of religious connotations, right? Arthur goes out, rescues Prin, that's her name, and puts Lucifer back in his place. Gameplay-wise, it's very similar to Ghosts and Goblins. The major upgrade, if there ever was one, is that Arthur can throw up or down while jumping, which does offer a little bit more maneuverability and survivability for our time-cherished character. Much like a vast majority of games that put Capcom on the map, Ghosts and Goblins has fallen short. But there was a game released in 2021, Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection. Batman had a rough start. For many people, it wasn't until Sunsoft's NES entry that Batman was worth checking out in the modern video game world. For some, it might have been the Arkham series, which is a more modern take on the comic book hero, but for those in the middle, Adventures of Batman and Robin might be the game you experience Batman for the first time. Now, there are 4 distinct versions of this game. The Super Nintendo version was made by Konami, and it isn't that difficult. Hard, yes, but not incredibly difficult. The Game Gear version was made by Nova Trade, and it's kind of wonky, as to be expected. However, Clockwork Tortoise worked on the Genesis and the Sega CD version, of which the Genesis version is renowned for its absolutely bopping soundtrack, as well as being hard as a beaver in a lumberyard. Much like a vast majority of the games we spoke about today, and I'm sure it'll come up again, level design, short lives, limited continues, and relentless enemies. Absolutely relentless enemies. It's like Temu sending out promotional emails. They don't stop and they won't stop until you win. The good news is it's a rather fun game and it's 100% worth having in your collection. The most recent Batman game worth talking about is Batman the Telltale series. And to me, almost all Telltale series are fun as hell. The comic book kicked ass, so why not make a run and gun game featuring a character that is not historically known to run? Only gun. Robocop. Robocop moves as you would expect in this, clunking along, and any enemy contact garners damage. There's only a few continues and level design is much to be desired. If memorization is for you, then I think you might enjoy this. To me, this game is 100% a skill-based game, but it's still worth checking out. Comic Zone is a great game. The biggest issue I have with it is that it boils down to trial and error, often, and that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It just inflates the difficulty a little bit more than you would by default, you know? You have one life, but there are some opportunities to get more health or extra lives, so every hit counts. The levels are long and those healing items, few and far between. And in some cases, there's mandatory health loss. Yikes. But that being said, Comic Zone is a cult classic and it has a wonderful soundtrack. It looks great, and I do suggest that you check it out, even if just for a little bit. You know what's funny? Comic Zone wasn't even designed to be difficult. The lead programmer was pressured by the Sega Technical Institute to up the difficulty, and even in interviews he said that he regrets following that advice. I think the thought process at the time was that people were renting video games and they didn't want kids to beat them in one sitting, which I guess made sense from a commercial standpoint. I believe other companies did that as well. Echo the Dolphin is one of the most obtuse games I've ever played in my life. Period. I played some minimalistic titles, games that were difficult, games that weren't even in my native language, and all of those combined made more sense to me. As you might know, we play as Echo the Dolphin, who swims around doing normal dolphin things, screaming at walls, jumping up and down, and molesting the local wildlife. In case you didn't know, dolphins are perpetually horny. Why do we care? I don't even know. We jump up, we get teleported, we find a task to find a large whale, and then at some point fight the most terrifying thing I've ever seen underwater in my life. Echo does control well. Even having a surface for air didn't really bother me. It's the way that the game progresses that's so irritating. You'll be swimming around and you'll shout at a key glyph. It's this crystal thing that reacts to you shouting at it. A screen will pop up and it'll say things like, "A wall is a wall unless it isn't a wall. Thanks for talking to me in Lion King lyrics, I appreciate it." It might as well say, "You're a dolphin, go hump a fucking SeaWorld employee." I was beyond done with this game. The last few levels were obnoxiously difficult. Now, the most recent game was Echo the Dolphin, Defender of the Future for the Dreamcast, and if I remember right, I actually played this on the PS2. It was very gimmicky. We talk about treasure games a lot, and to be honest, the vast majority of treasure titles could have been on this list, be it Dynamite Headdy, Gunstar Heroes, Light Crusader, but Alien Soldier stands out among the rest because it's fairly consistent when it comes to difficulty. You'll get a small reprieve within the levels, with them being somewhat tolerable, and then you get to bosses. Once you get to the bosses, shit will hit the fan. It's also a very unorthodox game as well. The learning curve is steeper than a flat wall, and you're gonna die a lot. But it's rewarding because it's a consistent challenge surmounted by a consistent amount of action, and I'm all for that. To me, I think it's a great way to present your game, and it doesn't mess around. Historically, Contra has always been an incredibly difficult series. It was always known as the series of run-and-gun games that would kick you in the dick harder than an overzealous 3-year-old, which if you haven't taken a nut shot from an overzealous toddler, be thankful. The square cube law, it doesn't fuck around. Hardcore is the 6th mainline Contra game, predating Contra Legacy of War and coming out after Contra Force, which we don't talk about because that game blows. In the game, we play as either Ray Poward, Sheena Itranzi, or Brad Fang, a Wolfman. Fuck yeah, Wolfman. The whole idea is that they belong to the Unified Military Special Mobile Task Force KX, or simply Contra Hardcore. And they've been tasked to fight a spree of crime and illegal activity. Now, this game is brutal, and it's brutal for a few different reasons. The biggest one is that Konami mastered the art of enemy placement, which leaves little to no room for error. Also, if you're American, fuck you twice, because it's way harder than the Japanese version. With multiple endings, branching paths, and a pretty nifty slide mechanic that you need to master if you want to be effective, this is a game that will take you some time, but it's a great time the whole time, right? The most recent Contra game is a relatively recent one, Contra Operation Galuga, but think of Hardcore as a spin-off because it does have its own little pseudo-franchise, even having its own prequel in Hardcore Uprising. And that's it for today. What did you think about this list? What games absolutely made you question your childhood on an existential level? Make sure to comment down below. Who knows, maybe you'll give someone an opportunity to make a memory with a challenging game. Also, if you don't mind, we are close to 4,000 subscribers, which is insane. It's not something I thought I would ever say. So, if you have any friends or family that love remembering when life was a little bit easier to live, feel free to bring them to the community. Finally, the most important thing that you can do for me today is hit that thumbs up button if you don't mind. It directly affects the visibility of the channel and all the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.